Hello everyone, and welcome to this ECIPE online conversation. My name is Fredrik Eriksson, and I'm very pleased to welcome today Mathilde Fasting, a colleague in the world of think tanks who has recently published a fascinating book on Francis Fukuyama and what comes after the end of history. This is also our subject for today's conversation. Mathilde is an economist and economic historian, and she is a fellow at the Norwegian think tank Civita. She has a PhD in the economic history of ideas and has previously published several books in that field. And she joins me now from Oslo. Hello, Mathilde. I'm very glad to have you with me today.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine, absolutely.
Good.
So first of all, congratulations to your new book. I find it fascinating because it's a deep dive into the thinking of what is a remarkable person who has managed to set the tone for so much of Western thinking about politics, ideas, and the world since the late 1980s. His first major tract was The End of History and the Last Man. And I think this is the book that he is also going to be most remembered for. At the same time, it's also a book that has prompted a pretty robust disagreement among scholars and readers about what he actually said in that book. For instance, did he really say that the struggle between ideas and societies would end? Even now, people debate this. After the West left Afghanistan a few weeks ago with a tail between its legs, I read comments suggesting that Fukuyama had got it all wrong and that his liberal triumphalism after the collapse of communism was extraordinarily naive. And then again, there were others suggesting that, no, Fukuyama actually got it right. This is the type of conflict and the type of problems that will arise in Fukuyama's sketchbook. So can we start here, Mathilde? What was the core message from Fukuyama in The End of History?
I think it is what you said as the end. Those scholars that said that this is things that's going to happen in real history, but the history of ideas, which is about ideologies and how we can, at the best, our best capacity to create societies, political orders, as he called them, that will work. And his message was, and still is, that liberal democracy is, for the time being, the best thing we have ever made up, our humans for human societies, which means that I think that he actually wants to say that the ideological struggle is complete, as for the time being. And I'm also adding for the time being, because as he says, we don't know what the future will bring, but as it is for now, has been for the last 30 years, liberal democracies are probably the best we're going to have. And then he adds, because he's a little pessimistic as well, you could look at it as, for instance, Winston Churchill did, in saying that it's the least bad one, not the best, but the least bad one, which means, and also contains these real history things that are happening all the time: democracies declining, liberalism under threat, all those things that we see around us. So I think the short answer will be that he says, if we are going to design or going to think about a political system that we would like to live under, liberal democracies are still the ones that will be the best we can manage.
So, I mean, there's been a few interpretations, or at least a few commentaries about people, scholars that have been reading The End of History and The Last Man, suggesting that sort of what you take it from there is basically that there is no other challenger to liberal democracy as an idea. So we had in the past different type of ideas, which of course came with a different ideological package, to put it mildly, and different ideas for how do you organize society, what's the role of the state in a society. And many of these ideas, if they hadn't collapsed before, they collapsed in 1989. But what would you say about sort of those who makes the case, for instance, people like Samuel Huntington, that, well, if you look around the world, you can see many different ideas for how to organize society, but they may not be dressed up in the typical ideological fashion that comes from sort of an ideological book, maybe sort of more religious type of ideas of society. It may be sort of historical, cultural. You have sort of a broad discussion in some quarters right now about the emergence of civilizational states, and there are some claiming that China is at least aspiring to become a civilizational state, meaning that there is at least some fundaments in that thinking about sort of the core principles that should guide society, and you can, at least to some extent, compare them to an ideological concept of how society should work.
Yes, I think that when it comes to China and when it comes to other countries with strong beliefs in their own political system, and he's not saying, and I'm not saying that you won't have contenders to liberal democracies. You always have, and right now it seems that China, and also for Fukuyama, is the most in lack of other words, the most popular one, or the most in coming in for being something that other countries would look at and say, look at what they're doing in China. That looks like a very good political system that we might want to take a closer look at. But for Fukuyama, I think that liberal democracies are actually like two main things. The one thing that he says, and this is just on principle as an idea of a liberal democracy, he says that first of all, it gives us, and that's probably the least read part of his book, The End of History. It is about how we treat each other as human beings. He says that it's the reciprocity that we have, the respect that we have for others, the freedom that each one of us can live under when we're living in a liberal democracy, that we are free to choose. This is and respected for that. That is, I think, probably the forgotten thing about a very important message that he had in The End of History, because the last part of that title of that book was "And the Last Man," and that goes back to Nietzsche. And The End of History is, of course, Hegel thinking. So he is deeply influenced by philosophers before him. But he says that all around the world you will have liberal democracies coming in all kinds of different shades, and also in his discussions with Samuel Huntington, who I wrote a book as an answer to The End of History from Fukuyama, that first came as an article, and that article came actually a couple of months before the Berlin Wall, which was, I think, some of the reason why it gained so much attention after a while, because he wrote it and published it in the summer of 1989, and he then claimed this, the main idea that we have been talking about, and that was before the Berlin Wall, and nobody at that point really thought it was possible for that wall to just crumble like it did only a couple of months later. Not even Fukuyama, I think, really believed it was going to happen. He said probably it's going to happen, but that fast was really hard to see at that point. But then he wrote this book in 1992, and Samuel Huntington came back with his answer, Clash of Civilizations. And I think that the disagreements between Fukuyama and Huntington, and I have to add that Huntington was actually Fukuyama's teacher when he was doing his PhD. So they knew each other very well, and I think they disagree about the core of culture, because Fukuyama has a much more dynamic view of that. He says that people are influencing each other. Histories are made up. They come in contact with other people. They are always like changeable, not fixed. And in the core, I think the disagreements between those two were that Samuel Huntington probably had a more set up idea of civilizations, grouping them in about, I think, 7 different civilizations, and quite often linking that to religion as well. So it means that while Fukuyama says that these things can change over time, Huntington wouldn't say they won't change, but he would be more fixed into those ideas. And then probably also saying that an idea within one religion about a human society and political systems might be better suited for that religion or that civilization, and another one, like the Western civilization, would be suited for liberal democracies, whereas Fukuyama, he doesn't think it is like that. I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
No, it does, and it prompts me to think about a few follow-up questions. I mean, one which immediately follows from it. I mean, to what extent is Fukuyama a universalist who basically believes that the institutions of democracy and liberalism can be emerged sort of in any type of culture, in any type of society? And to what extent is he sort of, on the contrary, sort of very attentive to the finer points of culture, and that they may promote different societies that, at least in some people's thoughts, require different political systems?
This is actually, I think, one of the most difficult and probably one of the best questions I've had in a long time, because it's really hard. This is the core of what and how you could say that liberal democracies, that they have one. Is it for everyone? Is it for universal? Is it for all societies at all times? Even though societies have different developments, they are in different phases of their development. They're modern, they're not so modern, they're doing this and that, and they have this and that kind of history. But is there at least an idea that can be universal? And at some point, I think that Fukuyama thinks so. So I think he is in his core believing that with globalization, with modernization, with all the things that are coming with our way of communicating, just think about, he wrote this before social media, he wrote this before we had this enormous contact that we have, but we were in the beginning of it. And I think that he still believes that, because if he doesn't, then it would be hard to still believe that liberal democracies are the one, or have won as he kind of claims ideologically. So that's the answer to that first question. And the second question is also tougher, but it's I think in his view, and also what I mentioned about Huntington, he's very attentive to differences in culture, history, religion. But even though he wants to see all those small differences and big differences as well in some countries, between some countries, he still believes that the wheel will kind of go in the direction of liberal democracies anyhow, because of the contact we all have with each other around the globe.
All right, let us just dig a little bit.
The thing is that he thinks it's harder for a culture to stay without development in a world like we have today, because people are traveling, well, not on the COVID, but people are traveling, people are talking to each other to a much larger extent than they were before, and that's why it's harder to keep, unless you do like North Korea, try to keep people inside the border and not letting them have contact with other people.
Yep. We're going to come back to this issue, because I think this also bears on some of the core thinking that comes from the books by Fukuyama on political order that came later. So let's come back to that. But I want us to dig a little bit deeper into sort of the end of history thesis, because it was so provocative and it has been so differently interpreted by so many people. So you mentioned previously sort of the thought figure here, the end of history, which is a product, of course, of Hegel. What can we say about sort of the intellectual genealogy of Fukuyama himself? I mean, I find it pretty striking that he came as a scholar. I got the feeling sort of that he was much more sort of anchored in the humanities. I think he spent quite some time with Alan Bloom at that time at Cornell. He went to France in order to understand sort of postmodernism a bit better, partly as an exercise to understand literature, but of course also related to philosophy. And the book itself, The End of History, what would you say? I mean, to what extent is it a product of philosophy rather than a product of sort of an astute observation of major trends in the world at the time when he started to write that article in, which I think was in 1989 when the first article came out. Because even if you can go in and discuss sort of his analysis of the West or of different other societies that ran on different ideological principles, but there is also a pretty substantial degree of philosophical thought in the book, which seems more anchored in more sort of perennial discussions about man, which draws a lot from, you know, Friedrich Nietzsche and many other thinkers from, well, sort of 19th century and perhaps going a little bit beyond that, but of course then again from early 20th century as well. So to what extent is it a product of philosophy rather than observations about major world trends?
I think you're into an important point about Fukuyama himself there, because I think that it's actually, I don't think he could have written or even conceived the idea if he didn't have that background of his, which I'd briefly mention is, like you've read in the book, and I asked him about that. There are many things there, but first of all, he started out studying literature, as you said, humanities, absolutely, and also Greek thought. He learned Greek in order to read Greek in the original language, in order to read Plato, for instance. He spent a lot of time doing that in his first years of study, and then he went, as you said, to France in order to understand Derrida, which he says quite frankly that he didn't understand much, and he by that time he decided to change. So he changed his studies from humanities, from classics, and over to political science, which was, I think, to him, when he first discovered that, he was very happy. So he finished his classics, and then he went over to Harvard, and he met finally Huntington, and he came immersed into political science and all those things. But he had with him this classical heritage in a way. And also another thing that is important is his family background. He's originally Japanese. He's born and raised in the US, and also his father, but his mother's coming from Japan, and his grandparents on that side, they were, or at least his grandfather on that side, he was a professor at the University of Kyoto, and he brought with him a European heritage of 20th century scholars like Max Weber, like other thinkers, probably also Nietzsche, Hegel, I don't know, but many books. And he got hold of them at an early age. And I think he has always been interested in European thought as such. So what I said to him when I met him is, are you actually European in heart? Are you actually coming from here, living in the US, but your thinking is that much more like you would find in a European university or in some place like where you are in Brussels or wherever. But and then he kind of nods and he smiles. He's a quite timid person. He's very humble in a way. I also think he is a person that can admit to mistakes. He can think about and reflect about his earlier thoughts and revising them and coming to new conclusions. So even though he's still, as I started with saying, that he still keeps on to this liberal democracy ideas, and many other things have changed. So that is a little bit about his background, and I think that for him, drawing on these things, he ended up by seeing the world through many lenses, and made him write this book, End of History. And also you could see that in other books that he's continuously been writing, at least, for instance, in his last book about identity that came right before COVID, but after Donald Trump won the presidential elections in the US. So it came in 2017, 18, I think. But then again, the last thing I would mention is as his father, he was studying sociology, and Fukuyama said to me that he, as a young man, said that I don't want to be like my father, so I don't want to have anything to do with that area of study. So he didn't want to go into sociology. And finally he says, now where am I? I'm actually probably much more into it than my father ever was. So he's been reading a lot of that after his formal studies. So I would say that his background is really broad, and that is, I guess, what makes him so interesting when it comes to participating in the public debates.
One final question on the end of history, which is about technology and the progress of technology. I mean, that was one part of the end of history in The Last Man, where he basically made the claim that sort of the technological progress that was achieved in the liberal West, the liberal capitalist West, that was all in awe of people living in other societies, and that they would sort of gradually conform to a liberal market economy because they also wanted to enjoy the fruits of modern consumption culture. I think he at one point basically says that the world, sort of the VCR, which was back then sort of a major technology, was going to homogenize the world upon liberal economic principles. And that would sort of a very tech deterministic way of looking at it. Is that something that he has maintained afterwards, or has he taken a different view on the role of technology for societal developments?
When he wrote a book about the development in biotechnology, not technology as such as you're talking about, internet and things, but he was kind of optimistic. He said that just as you were saying now, he said that internet, the technology that brings us iPhones and modes of communicating and all those things, he had a positive view on that from the beginning, I guess, when it started in the 1990s. And at least this book that I'm referring to is from just around 2000, 2001. And I confronted him with that and said, you still have this views now? And he said, no, I'm kind of disappointed. It's not the way that I thought it was going to develop. Still is a good thing for liberal democracies for people to participate, which they do by using social medias and things, but he has really big concerns about all the downsides. So, and then again, if we are taking that over to China about surveillance, about all those things he could do with technology, it's really hard for him to say today that this is just a positive development. On the contrary, he's been trying to do many different things. Among them is an initiative of trying to develop an idea about something called middleware, which is, I guess, easily explained, something in between the user and the like Facebook or any of those providers, and saying that you should kind of have the possibility to influence a little what you are seeing, where you are participating, and not just being, I guess, victim of algorithms and the big tech companies. So I'm not sure if he will succeed in that, because it's really hard to see how you could break that up. But he's concerned, and not as positive as you said he was in the beginning of the 1990s.
All right, so let us leave the end of history and The Last Man. Fukuyama has been very productive writing many other books, and we are in a while going to come to your own analysis and his analysis about where we are today, about liberal democracy today. But before we do that, I think it can be useful just to go through some of the other books as well and talk about them, partly because I think it's possible to see in some of his other books sort of an intellectual journey for him of leaving what could perhaps be described as Fukuyama being a typical neoconservative, or at least having a typical neoconservative view of the world. And then in the 1990s, he came out with a book on trust, then came a book on state building, and then came two major books on political order. There were other books as well, of course, but I think these books gets to the heart of what Fukuyama wants to say about stable and peaceful societies and how they arise, and potential also what makes them to fall after a while. So if we come here then to Fukuyama's sort of grand idea about the state and society, he has once said, perhaps jokingly, that Denmark was his ideal country, and that of course infuriates someone from Sweden and someone from Norway. But granted, Denmark is a fantastic society. So if we take that model of thinking, so what lessons are there for other countries from Denmark? Are there universal aspects in a Danish history of creating a stable and modern societies that other societies could import, where we could plant them into other countries? Or are these developments very unique to, in this case, Denmark itself? I don't want to go into Danish history, but sort of using that as a model for how to think about these issues.
Well, first of all, the "getting to Denmark" phrase was a phrase that they had in the World Bank, and it was just like a metaphor of saying that Denmark was the kind of ideal society, Scandinavia as well, of course, Norway, Sweden, but again, Denmark. And I think also to Fukuyama, because he went there on to be a guest lecturer at the Aarhus University for some time. I guess that he knows Denmark quite well, so it was natural for him to pick up that phrase and using it when describing this ideal model of a liberal democracy, which builds on three different things. It's the rule of law, it is the state capacity, the bureaucracy, and it is the participation, democratic participation, accountability. So he says that actually getting to Denmark had to do with the absence of corruption and having a modern state, which he also says here, I think is much harder to get than just having a state, a big state that provides welfare benefits to people. That was really the reason for my interest. So he was, I think, starting with not maybe starting with the book Trust, because that's a little on the side on this theme here, but he says this in the state building book. He says it because he actually turned in the beginning of this century, he turned to work with developing countries like in Latin America. Lately, he has been working a lot in Eastern Europe and also former Soviet Union states. And he's been really thinking a lot about what makes a state work. And also, of course, the experiences that the US had in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, and those things really inflicted his thoughts a lot. And the most important idea was that he says, I have been neglecting the role of the state. I thought when I wrote The End of History that that wasn't as important as I've come to understand now. And if you're looking at things that he is writing now and has been written for ever since the Political Order books came in 2011 and 2014, the state has really been his main issue. And by that, I mean all things around the state, which with its bureaucracy, with its mode of working, with all the things that can go wrong and so forth, all those things he treats first of all in the origins of political order, telling the story of many different societies in the world, and then maybe this even more important book about political order and political decay. And in the decay word, you find a lot of things that can go wrong that he describes, and which you can find all over the place in all societies. And I think that's probably the most important change in his thought all over, if you look from the 1989 until today. It is the importance of the state and the capability, not the size, but the mode and the mode of working, how a state can ensure the things that the inhabitants want, or the citizens in that society, what they need and what they want, and how the state can provide that. So he's not into a big state. He's not into And but he's not afraid of the state. And I think that for us living in, or at least for me living in Norway, I've never been very afraid of the state, because, but as a US citizen, you might just think about it completely differently. So it depends on where you live. And I think that his occupation or preoccupation with the state has a lot to do about his being an American and living in the US, where he sees that that is really something that they should have paid much more attention to. At least also in all the operations that they have had in different countries, like in Iraq, for instance. He says quite bluntly that they thought that the state was there, but it wasn't. So it was a misconception, a misunderstanding, completely failure to think that it was just to come and make democracy, making participation. That's the easiest thing you do, giving people a vote. But what are they voting for? And if you don't have a state or any capacity at all to do all those things that the citizens want, what do you do then? So I'm not sure if that's. But I think the picture about the state and the idea about the getting to Denmark, the state is absolutely the most important part, the most difficult one and the most important one.
Indeed, we should also say that, of course, Fukuyama had this famous break with many of his older friends from sort of neoconservative circles, in the sense that he didn't believe in sort of the proposition that you could build up stable liberal democracies, in this case at the point of a gun, in Iraq or in Afghanistan. He wrote a book where he took sort of a very strong stance against this particular idea.
And he also says, of course, that was difficult for him personally, because they were good friends and he had been working with a lot of them, and he still has issues with that. So of course, when Donald Trump was elected president in the United States, he still had, or still has, Republican friends. He's not voting Republican anymore. He did in his youth, but he's not there anymore. But he says it's really difficult, and the polarization that you could see overall in the United States, it also comes down to friendship, and it comes down to his personal life as well.
But in his books on political order, he's talking sort of about the historical background to why we have the emergence of successful states in some countries, including Denmark. Sorry.
That's okay.
I had forgotten to turn off my phone, sorry. No, but he has this analysis of what constitutes the successful states and how it emerges. And rather than talking about sort of the parts of the world where it didn't work, if we talk about the parts of the world where it worked, I mean, Denmark, for instance, or Europe more broadly. So what was the sort of historical ingredients that helped to create these fundaments for a successful state?
Well, he says that in a way, we didn't have, or at least the Danes didn't have, any kind of plan for creating a state or of creating a viable liberal democracy. It's actually something that just came about when you analyze it. And looking back, you could see that those countries that today are strong liberal democracies, they have had or follow a certain path, if you want to say, use that word. Started out by having rule of law in some sense. It's very important. And then a phase where state building, as he calls it, was the main thing. Building up bureaucracy, building up capacity in different areas. And I remember that from Norway, and it's probably why I chose to read his books on political order first, because I didn't read the End of History first. I read those two books first. And I recognized the pattern that had happened in Norway. We had a long period in the 19th century where state building was actually what we were doing. And then finally, we ended up by political participation and democracy, but that came last. That was the last step in this modernization progress of things going that way. But you know, countries can't choose that, and historically they didn't either. So you have different developments in different countries, although Northern Europe might resemble each other a lot, but then going to other parts of the world, you don't have that. And then that comes back to your question about what you can learn from Denmark, or what you can learn in countries that haven't modernized in this way, or that want to become more liberal or more democratic in a sense. And I think end of story for Fukuyama is that it must come from the people in the country themselves. They must be willing and wanting to create modern states. The worst thing for them is probably that they have to do many things at the same time. I mean, they cannot use, like we did in Norway, many hundred years establishing a liberal democracy. They don't have that time. They have to do it much quicker. They can get help, they can seek help, but it's up to them to decide. And I think that's his idea when he's talking about, I think, a place in Southeast Asia where he was, and he talks about education. He talks about people getting a sense of their projects in a way. So in a way, he's saying that a word that might be dangerous for some, but that might be important in this story here is nation building, state building. So he says you have to have an idea and you have to go on with that. But the positive thing is that you have a lot of countries where you could pick and choose. You could look at different countries, Denmark, Germany, wherever you want to look, and see this is working, maybe this is working with us as well, because this resembles, we might find good ideas. We don't have to develop them ourselves. So that is the little hope, but he says it's difficult. So he won't try to put the model of Denmark onto different other countries by saying this is the recipe, this is how you're doing it. It's up to the countries themselves.
All right, very good. So let's move on to contemporary times, our current times, and hear your views and the views that you and Fukuyama have in the book on where we are right now. So when I'm reading the book, I'm getting the feeling that both of you are pretty pessimistic about not just the world, but in this case, perhaps more so about America. And that there is something in Western societies and perhaps the world that has ended, even if what has ended is not history. Sometimes I find it a bit difficult to follow his line of argument, and I think sometimes he can be even frustratingly simplistic in his views, especially when it comes to economics. But I think one thing that came out in your book is that he is deeply worried about liberal democracy and its future, and its future. So why don't we start there? So what is the thesis here? Are liberal democracies doomed?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think Fukuyama thinks so either. He has, as I mentioned to you before we started this conversation today, he has a book coming next year. And that's called, that book, at least the working title of that is Liberalism and Its Discontents. And he goes into too many of those things he sees around us now, and why he's pessimistic is, of course, because the US is, even though it's it's a big country, and it's very important to other liberal democracies that the US or the United States, that it functions in a way. So that's why he's so preoccupied with the US, because if the United States, if they fail, then what would be the leader, the star, the things, the country that people are following, like Western European countries? You need a strong and a big country that succeeds. So that's why when there are troubles in the United States, that will kind of move over to other countries as well, because they will start doubting what they are doing. And that's why also he sees the competition from China, because if China does well, then other countries might want to look at China. Even though I asked him directly, do you really think that people will, or countries will use China as a model? And he still says no, so he doesn't think so, but he's worried about that. And he also added that in 50 years, time will show. I might be wrong then, but well, in 50 years he's probably dead, because he's 68 years old now. So unless he becomes really old, well, anyway, he's pessimistic because the developments in the US, and he also says that started long before Donald Trump was elected president. So he said, as I also quote in the book, that he was horrified when Donald Trump won in 2016. But he says, as a political scientist, I was curious, because are the American institutions, are they strong enough to handle a person like Donald Trump on the top? And I think now, because we actually had the last interview and the last talks when this book was finished, I tried to postpone because we were coming into autumn last year, and I said we have to wait until we know the results of the presidential elections in November, and we did. So then he was, of course, happy that Trump didn't win twice, but we didn't know about the attacks on Capitol. We didn't know about those things. We didn't know what we now know. Maybe Trump is going to go for another presidency in 3 years' time. But anyway, I think that to some extent he's happy with that America coped with a president like Donald Trump. On the other hand, he says that all those softer sides that leads to polarization, to differences between people, to really a political debate that's not a debate. You're only shouting from each side of the corner, and you're not meeting in any sensible sense at all. You're just not listening to the others, and all those things that goes on, they are really hurting the political system, and those things are really difficult to recreate. And that's why he's mostly worried about the US. But then again, Norway is not the same as US either. Neither is Belgium, Germany, or any other country in Western Europe. So you can't really compare, but you have things in common with liberal democracies, because there are problems also in Western Europe, but not maybe to the same extent as you have in the US. But you have neighbors like Hungary, Poland, with presidents and political parties going into something that Fukuyama and others call illiberal democracies, and maybe just democracy in the name, but not liberal to any practical sense. And when liberal democracies are attacked, it's usually not the democratic part that's attacked, it's the liberal part. And that's also important, and he makes a point of that in his new book.
Yeah, no, indeed. So what's the root cause then of this particular development, that you have a challenge against liberal democracy at home in America, or indeed in some other countries? Even if there are differences between Western countries, it seems to me that many of the countries are facing similar type of problems, even if the scale of the problems, or is at least the scale of the revolt against liberal democracy, isn't the same.
It's, I think he mentions, and also we have that in the political debates in Norway, it's social inequality, because social inequality means that people are losing status. They don't have the same expectations to the future as they had before, and all those kind of things that will follow. It's difficult, but at the same time, if you look at social inequality all over the globe, it's actually diminishing. But that doesn't mean anything to countries where, like Norway, if social inequality rises in Norway, we will think about Norway, not that anyone in India or China has had a better life or will have a better life. So you have to look at it. It's always in the local context. And liberal democracies, they have probably been thinking more about how globalization would be good for everyone, but it has been maybe not taking as seriously as they should have the things that will happen in a country when Chinese cars are coming, when people are answering online, doing their jobs from India, from other places, and then replacing Norwegians, Swedes, or Americans, or whatever. So it's a big picture that probably on the economic side, liberal democracies haven't been foreseeing to the extent that they should, and then it's the discontent that follows. So, and that is of course not only for the US, that's also of course for Europe and for countries like the ones that we are living in here. So so social inequality is one thing. The other thing is that social media in itself, and also, as he says, when it comes to right-wing and left-wing populism that he's talking a lot about, you would see that he's most afraid of the right-wing populism, like you will have like going into very a populism that will treat people not as people living in a country, but different groups. What you're saying, this is, I'm talking to you, and you might not be the whole part of the population in a country. It might be just a group, and that group thinking is also something that he's really afraid of. And he's saying that as long as you will permit different groups to have they can be legitimate, they can have claims that absolutely is important to listen to. And when it comes to the US with racism, Black Lives Matters and all those things, it is not to say that they are not in their absolute right and should claim the things that they do. But when that becomes the most important thing, and you forget that you're also an American, to put it just bluntly, then it is going to do something to the society and to liberal societies, because liberal societies are based on universalism. It's based on rights for everyone and equal treatment of everyone. And I think that's in the core what he's afraid of, and personally that I am afraid of as well.
So if we flip this around then and we talk about, so how can we sort of bend the curve for liberal democracy so that it goes in the right direction? What's necessary to do?
First of all, the reason for me writing this book and finally talking to Francis Fukuyama was that we need to, if you want to defend liberal democracies, you actually have to know what it is, and you have to know how the different parts, what is important, and how you could move on. So first part is just to understand society. And as I also said in the introduction, I was born and raised in Norway, and taking Norwegian society for granted. I mean, you do when you live, if you are young and you think it's, and I was young also in 1989, and things looked good. So you didn't really have to think so much about politics, about social inequality, about liberal democracies as such, because you took it for granted. You could go and vote. Everything was kind of working. You could disagree with things, but anyway, by the end of the day, it was okay. But then I finally saw that you actually have to stand up. You have to use your voice. You have to be willing to get into arguments. You have to work for it. It's not something that's just there and it's never going to change. The Political Decay book, for instance, is a book about all those different things, small things and big things that can go wrong. And like the developments in Hungary and Poland, you see that it starts out and then step by step, smaller steps, but it goes in one direction and you have to stop that. So I'm not saying that we can't do that in countries like, well, Western European countries or other countries where people live and are listening to this, but you just have to find out what is the problem. And then when you find out what is the actual problem here in our society? Is it the media? Is it the politicians? Is it the economic system? What is it? And then you can start working on that. So we're not doomed at anyhow. And going back to the first phrase that Fukuyama said, liberal democracies is still the best of the worst things that we have. And by that he means it's a lot of job all the time. And that's what he's also doing by writing books and articles and participating.
I suppose one element of it is to provide people with more opportunity, right? I mean, coming back to the issue about social inequality that you talked about, you have a section in your book where you talk about recognition, themos, and having societies that are observant of different people and make sure that there's a future which includes respect and recognition for every individual. If they chooses to go in that particular direction, then it may be that everyone is not going to choose that path for themselves.
Yeah.
So what would that really include? I mean, I've been following sort of the discussion around sort of identity politics and the crises, and sometimes I'm getting a bit pessimistic, thinking that, well, this sounds like almost, you know, a religious war between different fractions. Sort of Catholics and Protestants are banging their heads against each other. On the other hand, it may be issues that you can resolve by policies as well. And if so, what type of policies would that be?
Well, first of all, liberal democracies is also well, at least the only system that we have, political system that we have where pluralism is possible. Pluralism in every sense, the people living their own lives according to their wishes and wants, and also religions and everything that is also the most difficult thing, because if you're living with people that are wanting completely different things from yourself, you have to tolerate that, and you have to be able at least to say that we are still living in one society, even though we have very different views on lots of things. So it comes down to finding a small core, it's not strong enough core to say that, well, you want that, I want this, we are in the same society, so we have to agree on just a minimum. And Fukuyama is not afraid of saying that might be some kind of history, it might be some kind of common ground that could be. He's actually talking about national identity stories. It might be a little difficult for many countries to think about that, but he says there must be something more than just the basic fact that you can vote and that you are a citizen. You have to have something around the idea of being a Norwegian, of being an American, of being a French, well, anything. It has to be something else, something more, but not excluding people. And you could just, by listening to me now, understand how difficult this is, because what can it be? He's jokingly saying that Italy is not, it's not a country. They are only a country when they play football, winning, or, you know, and maybe football is it. Maybe that's what they should all agree on, and that when they're really feeling that they are Italian, it's when they play football. And he also says that if you search in your heart and say, if your country should come into a situation where you go to war, which side will you be on? Who will you defend? So you have to be willing to go into those deep, maybe cultural, social, historical things as well, even though everyone is not a part of that from the beginning, because as I said, this will happen in plural societies and not in like Norway for 100 years ago, or Sweden also 100 years ago, mostly with Swedes, ethnical Swedes living in Sweden, and same with Norway. You don't have that anymore and you can't go back there. But it's hard.
Right. It is hard indeed. It is hard indeed. All right. Thank you very much, Mathilde. This has been very, very interesting and stimulating to talk. I'm going to, towards the end now, put a couple of questions to you that we have received from people that have listened. I won't be able to even remotely get close to taking all of these questions up, but at least a few of them. So if we start with thinking about challenges to liberal democracy today, is there sort of a constitutional fix to it? And perhaps not constitutional just by thinking in a pure fashion about constitutions, but more thinking about sort of the broader institutional framework we have in the West, and whether that needs to be adapted to better reflect societies as they have evolved. If we need to have stronger protection in some areas. There is one question, for instance, referring to the fact that freedom of speech is challenged in some countries. That this, of course, also connects to sort of the broader recognition issues, whether sort of if you have sort of personal views that are deemed to be beyond the pale in societies, can you express them? And if you can't, what happens then if you don't find sort of platforms or environments where you can exchange in ideas and discussions, which allows you to be part of the conversation? So in that broad constitutional type of thinking about societies, are there something that we need to do in Western societies to become better?
Well, freedom of speech is, I guess, the most important thing, at least. Well, if you are saying the most important thing for even thinking about liberal society or liberal democracy, I think